Good evening. Thank you for coming and welcome. Well, you may think that the Renaissance is dead, but you won't think that after you hear our speaker tonight, Captain Pete Hegseth. Pete is an Ivy League scholar, is an infantry soldier, military analyst, a veterans advocate, and until tonight, I don't know about the rest of you, I'd never met anyone who had won the Bronze Star, but Pete's won two. Pete began his academic career at Princeton. There he joined ROTC, which was his entree into the military. While he was at Princeton, he was also the editor of the local conservative newspaper, the Princeton Tory. So one might say that he actually began his military career a little earlier, even though before he got into the Army. After 9/11, Pete had 3 deployments in the Middle East. He was in the counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. He served with the 101st Airborne in Iraq, and he was the infantry platoon leader in Baghdad. Captain Hegseth also was a guard at Gitmo between 2004 and 2005. He has been active, very active in veterans groups. We'll hear about that a little bit tonight, I believe. He's sort of transitioned a little bit into more media. We've all know him, of course, from different shows on Fox News, but he was an embed in Iraq for the National Review some years ago as well. He has a new book out called In the Arena. Sadly, it's not quite available, but some of you have little flyers on your chairs. There's not enough for everybody, so we thought we could kind of share. It will be available next month, and there's some information on how to get that book. The book deals with America's role in the world and national security. So please help me give a great conservative forum welcome to Captain Pete Hegseth.
Well, can you hear me? What an honor it is to be. You guys motivate me. I didn't know there were this many conservatives in Silicon Valley. Come on. It's outstanding. And I should have learned my lesson. It's not a funny joke to raise your hand for Hillary Clinton behind the podium. That was a joke, everybody. My wife tells me I'm not funny. I should just give up on it, because I'm not. I'm grateful to be here and to see the list of speakers that have been here at this forum. It's humbling to be standing here in the shadow of guys like Andrew Breitbart and Alan West and so many other incredible, Steve Forbes and people that have been here. What an amazing lineup of folks you have seen. I will do my level best to contribute modestly to what they have done before. I want to thank the Conservative Forum here, Erica, for facilitating this. I met her at a National Review cruise, and she introduced me to what you guys do here, and I said, absolutely, as soon as I can get here, I will. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the U.S. military, winning wars, or social engineering. And if you're like me, you've watched over the last 7 years under this administration the face, the ethos, the perspective of our military change greatly. And I got a chance to meet a lot of you before the event. Many of you military yourselves, equally frustrated with what's happened. So we're going to talk a little bit about the state of the military, what it means to win wars, what Obama's social engineering agenda has been. I'll talk a little bit about America in the world, and then a little bit about veterans at the end as well, a personal passion of mine, I know as well, a lot of yours, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, and nothing is off limits. So the state of the military. At the beginning of this administration, there was a little policy through a series of different events called sequestration, the Budget Control Act, that was, the White House will tell you it was the Republicans' fault, but in reality, it was their inability to lead or take part in any meaningful process that led to sequestration. The most damaging of which was defense sequestration. Here we are 7 years later with no real budget contributions or changes having been made. Our Army's the smallest it's been since 1940. Our Navy is the smallest it's been since 1915. And the Air Force the smallest it's been in its history. Think about that. Now, if you remember Barack Obama and Mitt Romney in the 2012 debates, Barack Obama said, well, that's because we don't use bayonets and horses anymore. You remember that? Because all the ships and the planes have more capabilities, and that is true. There's no doubt a fighter jet today or a ship today or an infantry platoon today has a lot more firepower than, say, 1940 or 1915. But there is still a quality to quantity all its own. You need boots to be in certain places. You need ships to police certain lanes. You need planes to monitor the sky. And when you take away those capabilities and the modernization, you start to undo our military. Now, Barack Obama decided to take a peace dividend in the middle of wartime, which tells you everything you need to know about how seriously he took the threats that we face. Of course, he was elected in his mind to end wars, right? Which is exactly what he did. And I'll talk a little bit, well, he didn't end any wars. He ended wars on paper, creating even worse ramifications as a result. So right now, we are standing on the back of the Reagan buildup, more or less. What Ronald Reagan did to rebuild after Jimmy Carter is something we're still standing on right now as a military in many ways. Bill Clinton undid a lot of that. George W. Bush came in and funded the military, but a lot of that funding of the military in the Bush era was poured into combat zones. And in increasing capabilities in combat zones. You go to war with the army you have, not the army you want, as Rumsfeld famously said, and it took us many years to get where we needed to be for new battlefields that weren't necessarily anticipated. The other money that was spent at that time was oftentimes used to sort of patch up weapon systems and other platforms that hadn't been modernized for a long time. So following all of that, you get Barack Obama, you get sequestration, and now we understand why we're seeing the erosion, literally a lot of the gutting we see of the military today. Now, we still are the most powerful military the world has ever seen today. There's no one that can even remotely touch us. And if you look at our special operators, if you look at what we can do with aerial unmanned drone systems, you look at intel fusion cells, the ability to rapidly gather, disseminate, and execute on intelligence today, we're better than we've ever been. There's no doubt that the American military can bring pain where it needs to bring around the globe, in spite of what this administration has done and the lack of focus this White House has put on the military. But there's also no doubt that it is smaller, older, and less advanced than it has been in quite some time. So I want to take it down from the 30,000 foot level, however, and take it down to the grunts, the guys on the ground. What's the ramification of these cuts in the state of our military to the trigger pullers? There's a lot of things you need in the military, first of which is training. You think they're getting more of it? You think they're getting better training? I just got out of the military, out of the National Guard a year and a half ago. I stay in touch with a lot of folks. One of the blessings, really, of being on Fox News Channel and talking about vets and military issues and national security issues is I get to hear from a lot of currently serving, currently training, overseas, here at home, that say, hey, please bring voice to what we're seeing and what we're experiencing. It's a humbling thing, really. And I do my best. The biggest return on investment I feel like I ever have is when I get a note from someone that says, thanks for saying that. Thanks for saying what we can't say or what we're experiencing. And I can tell you what they're experiencing is less training, less dynamic training, less nuance in that training. More, some of you in the military, you've heard of notional training, right? It's kind of the bang-bang military exercise, a notional enemy, a notional training exercise, a notional movement. It means you don't actually do it. It means you think about it, and you talk about it, and you notionally train. Now, I'm not saying that's happening everywhere across. Elite units are doing elite training, top units are doing top training, but you nip at the margins, right? You nip at the margins of those capabilities, and pretty soon readiness erodes a little bit. And I'll tell you this as a platoon leader, what keeps your guys motivated more than anything else? Good training. When they're engaged actively in meaningful training that would prepare them for the enemies that they face, that raises morale. When you're not doing that, morale takes a hit. And I think a lot of you expressed this to me early on, and I've certainly seen it myself. Morale is at extremely and dangerously low levels across our military today. We've got a rudderless commander-in-chief that doesn't even believe in or invest in or articulate the enemy we face and the missions we're undertaking. Training is not what it once was before. And you add all that together, and the guy on the ground carrying the rifle starts to wonder what it's all about and whether or not his leaders have his back, which ultimately means more than anything. You guys that have walked the block, that have led a platoon or led a squad in any service, understand that you've got a great deal of confidence when you know that your commander at any level has your back. Whether it's the squad leader to the team leader or the platoon leader to the squad leader, that means everything. Your battalion commander, your brigade commander, but when the man at the top, you question whether he will have your back in those difficult situations, it trickles all the way down. And the ethos does as well. It also, I just talked about training technology. Our weapon systems have not been modernized for quite some time. The average age of an air platform and aircraft today is 27 years old in the United States Air Force. The average lifespan of a platform like that is 20 to 30 years. We haven't invested. Look at the F-35, which is going to cost us $1 trillion. That isn't just Barack Obama's fault. That's also a bureaucratic Pentagon problem that can't procure weapons systems as efficiently as it should be. So I don't want to stand up here and point only at Barack Obama. The Pentagon has not been wise about every dollar that it spends. It could be more efficient in how it develops weapon systems of the future. And because it's too bureaucratic, it spends a lot of money on a system that fails and then has to start all over again. And when you do that in an environment where funds are limited and where there isn't a priority on the military, you really can see where you can start to fall behind. And where there are countries on this earth today, because history isn't over, seeking to close the gap in our technological capabilities like the Chinese, that becomes a very dangerous situation. History, if there's one, it's a principle I talk about a lot in the book, if there's one thing you should remember, and I think as conservatives do remember, is that history is not over. Human nature is not perfectible. That's what Europe lost sight of a long time ago. They thought they could just sort of pop a squat and they're good to go with their Western utopia for all time. Gut their militaries, fund their welfare state, drink their tea, and all is going to be well. Well, it turns out there's a lot of other people with other plans for the future. Whether they're radical Islamists or authoritarian despots in Eastern Europe, guys like Vladimir Putin, or frankly, globalists, internationalists who seek to take away the sovereignty of that state. Look what the sovereign European states did in handing over that sovereignty to the EU, what in many ways has become an absolute failed experiment and exploited by enemies who have sought to infiltrate from the inside, exploiting a migrant crisis into Muslim communities throughout Europe. And then it's tactics. We've got a military right now. So I talked about training, talk about technology and tactics, stuck a little bit between conventional warfare and asymmetric warfare. Fighting the big armies and the big movements versus fighting the shadow threats that we face in Iraq and Afghanistan. I could say as a platoon leader in Iraq in 2005 and 2006 that also worked with the local government, we were right at that inflection point where we hadn't really figured it out. We didn't know if we were fighting a conventional enemy, and a lot of our tactics were focused that way, but we should be fighting a counterinsurgency, and we hadn't yet really changed. If you remember, General Petraeus had to write the counterinsurgency manual during the war so that we could relearn what we had forgotten in Vietnam. A lot of you Vietnam veterans remember we had figured a lot of this. We wrote a manual about asymmetric warfare, about counterinsurgency, the Marine Corps manual, written about it, and we decided to unlearn it. And then when we needed it again, we had to dust it off. It wasn't applicable, so we had to rewrite it. And we're in the middle of the same kind of moment right now, where because the funding of our military is dictated by budget constraints, we're not looking at the threats on the horizon and orienting funding and priorities accordingly. So we're either training for asymmetric threats, but not conventional threats, or conventional threats and trying to forget asymmetric counterinsurgency. But take the enemy that is most top of mind for all of us right now, the Islamic State. They are both. They are both a guerrilla-style counterinsurgency that infiltrated and overtook, but now they are a standing army. They've changed their tactics because of some of the pressure that we put on them. Of course, not enough, and I'll talk more about that. But they hold territory. They defend that territory. And our ability to fortify, whether it's the Kurds or the Iraqis or the so-called Sunni Arab alliance that we're going to form to take them on, is not as effective as it could be, because in some ways we're confused about what type of role we're going to play in that battlefield. And the tactics and what we've learned from the battlefield today and how we apply them is a little bit confused. I taught counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. My job was to train incoming units about what was happening in the country, what was happening across different areas of the region, train Afghans, allies, and others. It was a difficult time. 2011, 2012 was right when Barack Obama had surged and then told the enemy when we're going to leave at the same time. Think about that. There's not a squash of common sense in the idea that you surge and then you immediately undermine your resolve in that effort. Why was the Iraq surge under George W. Bush successful? Because the jihadists thought he was maybe just crazy enough to finish it out. Right? Not crazy in a bad way, but committed, resolved, believed that the surge, we were there to win, and we were in to win. But when you announce a limited surge in Afghanistan, and then you immediately say we're leaving in 2 years, the Taliban just kind of laughs. And they say, well, you've got the watches, but we've got the time. A lot of you have heard that phrase. I heard it time and time again. All right, well, we'll wait it out, and we'll remind the members of the Afghan army, the members of the Afghan police, the members of the tribal councils, the members of the local government, that, yeah, you could side with the Americans now, you might get some free gear, you might get some cool stuff, but we're still here. We know your name, and we know your family, and we know where they live, and we'll be back. That psychological warfare is very powerful. And it also leaves our warfighters in an impossible position where the local population doesn't want to trust them. The Afghan allies don't know how committed we really are to that cause, so it creates a distance. And right when I was there, it was when the green on blue attacks, when the insider attacks were happening against American forces. And the Taliban was able to use that powerfully as well, because they got inside the minds of those so-called allies of the United States and used those attacks to create even more separation, which creates confusion, mistrust, and if you're trying to win a counterinsurgency or any sort of asymmetric battlefield with indigenous forces and there's no trust, I mean, forget about it. Forget about it. And on the tactics side, that doesn't even mention, none of this is even mentioned rules of engagement, which I know is a hot topic for a lot of us, certainly is for me as someone who was a platoon leader, who had to make some of those decisions, who had to advise on some of those decisions, and who was with a unit that was in a difficult spot at a difficult time. When you tie the hands of your warfighters and you put questions in their mind, whether they're in a cockpit or on the ground, you create more vulnerabilities for everybody. And you prolong the mission in difficult ways that only benefit the enemy and only complicate the mindset of those young Americans we send over there to fight. If only we could muster what we needed to muster in order to actually defeat, close with, and destroy the enemy that we face. I'll tell one example of a rules of engagement that actually worked when I was in Iraq. So rules of engagement are not universally bad. Rules of engagement are there to tell a warfighter when they pull the trigger or don't pull the trigger, because you wouldn't want to walk into a room and just start shooting. You have some parameters about why you shoot and when you shoot. It's used as a dirty word. It's not a universally dirty word. It's how you apply it. We had something called status-based rules of engagement in 2005 and 2006. If you were an American soldier on the battlefield in World War II, and you saw a German soldier, what could you do? Shoot him, right? He's eating lunch, he's doing whatever. If he's the enemy, you can shoot him, because he's wearing a uniform, he's a legitimate target. But not in a counterinsurgency, not in an asymmetric battlefield where the enemy doesn't wear uniforms, and where if they put the weapon down, well, you can't shoot them. Except when we instituted status-based rules of engagement, and there were two rules that were part of it. One, you had to know through two sources that that person was a known member of an insurgent group, enemy group in town. So you needed two independent sources that verified it. And then you needed someone who could, on site, either a source or a photograph, identify that that indeed was that person. Okay, right? But think about it. I mean, it's basic common sense. No, it actually makes sense. You just need to know that that's your target, right? So you're not just making it up. You're in a foreign land. People wear a lot of clothes. I just need to know that that's Muhammad, right? So, but as long as I've got two sources and I know that it's him and he's the leader of the cell, the Al-Qaeda cell in town, then the sniper can take him up when he's filling his car with gas. So he's filling his car with gas, and we've got a sniper on a rooftop, and suddenly he's not there anymore. And then it happens again, and then it happens again. And the psychological effect of known insurgents who are members of the enemy dying when they think they're safe because they've been trained to hide amongst the population had a massive psychological effect. We had a couple of insurgents come to us begging for amnesty because they thought they were on the list. The list was like 4 people long. But they thought it was a long list, and we knew everybody in the insurgency. But what happened? Now, it wasn't perfectly applied, and you've got to be smart about how you apply it, but eventually the lawyers took it away. Because it was complicated, because it's difficult, because war is messy. And the reason you hear presidential candidates talking about issues like rules of engagement at this point is that we tie our own hands. We tie our own hands because we don't have the courage of our convictions to fight war the way you need to fight it in order to win. You tap dance around the Islamic State, you're going to lose lots of Americans. Especially because if you're going to defeat the Islamic State, you're probably going to need American boots on the ground leading the way. Doesn't mean you need them doing everything or in mass formations, but a part of leading the way. But if they can't do what needs to be done, which means total war, then we shouldn't be sending them there to tap dance around that kind of enemy. Amen? Which brings me to the question of winning our wars. And I'm going to shamelessly plug briefly my book, which is called In the Arena. A lot of you know the quote, the man in the arena quote. It's not the critic who counts. It's not the man who points out how the strong men stumble. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by blood and sweat and dust, who strives for worthy causes. It's a famous quote that I had printed out and I brought with me to Iraq and Afghanistan and Guantanamo Bay. Then one day I read the speech, the entire speech that Teddy Roosevelt gave in 1910 in France. It's called Citizenship in a Republic. And it was sort of non-PC before there was PC. Telling us what the roadmap looks like for good citizenship. Republics cannot remain great if they don't have good citizens that understand why America is great and willing to fight for it. So the book is about citizenship, and it's about citizenship at home and leadership abroad, and having the courage of our convictions to be unapologetic. It's a call to arms, not an actual call to arms, but a call to civic arms to say it's time to stand up, it's time to fight where you are. Listen, I know Teddy Roosevelt had his unfortunate descent into the Progressive Party in 1912. Don't get me wrong, I know my history. I understand he failed while daring greatly and gave us Woodrow Wilson. I understand these things. Take the speech in its moment of time and the lessons it gives us, and I think it's an amazing roadmap. So I encourage you to take a look, and there are cards on the seat. It's just PeteHegseth.com is the name of the site. But he talks about, are we willing to prevail in war? Are we willing to do what is necessary? Or will we allow injustice to prevail? Are we the type of people that will allow perpetual injustice to exist? Or do we have the courage to fight whatever the cost, if the cause is worthy? And I think that's a question we have to ask ourselves. And he was talking to a French audience, which, as this gentleman talked about and others have seen in France and others, decided to give that fight up. They forgot what they actually believed in, and as a result, they were silently infiltrated, and as they have been. I mean, the most common boy's name in London today is Muhammad. That's not accidental. And you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to point out the facts. It's not just the radical Islamists that put on the bombings in Brussels and in Paris. It was the sympathetic groups of people that hid them and enabled them. I live in Minneapolis. There's a lot of wonderful people, a lot of wonderful Somalis in Minneapolis, but there's also an enclave that I went in 2 weeks ago with cameras from Fox News Channel, and we're going to have a special coming out in a couple of weeks talking about it, just talking to people. And when you have an entire generation of new immigrants that have been there for 15 years and don't speak English, that's a problem. And when you have a younger generation that comes in and their allegiance is questionable to this country because they want to go back to Somalia and fight with Al-Shabaab, or they want to go to Syria and fight with ISIS, that's a problem. And if you have mosques preaching hate or preaching radicalization, that's a problem. But if you don't have a country that understands what it believes without being racist, without being bigoted, not because you hate what's in front of you, but because you love what's behind you, because you love and understand what the country's all about. We have to fortify ourselves to be able to do that, or else we won't be able to prevail in the wars that we fight. Because our enemy doubts our resolve. What did bin Laden call us? Call us a paper tiger. Bin Laden believed he could suck us in, bleed us dry, financially and physically, and then we would flee the battlefield. That was his perception. Now, we proved him wrong in using Iraq as an example. We proved him wrong in 2003 when we steamrolled all the way to Baghdad. Then we kind of proved him right a little bit from 2004 to 2005. As we kind of muddled our way through and slowly left and the insurgency fueled. I was in Samara when the mosque bombing occurred in February of 2006. It was my second day on the job as the civil military operations officer in town. So I had to work with the local government. It was really a bang-up start to that operation. And it actually taught me a lot about politics. Tip O'Neill used the phrase, all politics is local. And it's very true. In fact, it created a massive opportunity inside Samara to get the tribes to work together, even though it ripped the seams off the entire country. Now, bin Laden was then proved wrong in 2007 and 2008 when George W. Bush doubled down and surged in Iraq to win. I'll never forget a quote that he gave in the Rose Garden, and listen, I'm from a small town in Minnesota. I didn't know, Joe Biden from John McCain before I walked up to Capitol Hill. I met my first senator 2 days before I found myself in the Oval Office because of what we were doing. But standing behind the president, and the president said, the future security of our country will be fought on the streets of Baghdad. And he said, if we leave too early, if we leave too soon, we will be sending our kids back to fight an even more vicious enemy. How prophetic. And that's exactly where we are. I will have you note, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was utterly decimated and defeated. Decimated. wasn't utopia. It wasn't going to be a Jeffersonian democracy, but it was stable. It had possibility. Its economy was moving. And Iraq has seeds for at least a civil society, an educated populace, a former bureaucracy, a past of some sectarian cooperation. There was some possibility there. And when we decided to abandon it, we abandoned all of that possibility. And when I hear on the campaign trail, and I don't want to get political with this, but we better have candidates that are willing to stand up and say that. We should hang the chaos of Iraq and ISIS around the neck of Barack Obama, not the Republicans. It's an unfortunate statement, but it's the truth. If we follow through, if we show resolve, we can win. America can do that. That's the lesson we should take from the Iraq War. Not that it's an utter failure. Just like I know when I talk to Vietnam vets who I empathize and sympathize with completely, especially because of how we were greeted the way we were greeted because of the way you were treated. And so I thank you for the way you greeted us. And I feel no greater kinship than with Vietnam veterans and what they gave this country. So I want to thank you, absolutely. Well, we didn't lose it on the battlefield, and we could have followed through with it. And then you go to Afghanistan. Afghanistan, a country that was much more difficult problem set. Obviously, we went for the right reasons and should have followed through. But it is a moral sin what they did in the Afghan surge. Now, I supported it to begin with because I want to believe in being successful on the battlefield. But to do things for political reasons, to declare and look at the memoirs of Bob Gates. Look at the memoirs of Leon Panetta. They all say it. The same thing. The Afghan surge, the good war, was political. It was about being tough somewhere because the Iraq war had to be bad. It was the bad war. And they surged cynically while telling the enemy when they were going to leave with never giving the commanders what they actually needed, with no real understanding of the dynamics on the ground, knowing they were going to tuck tail no matter what. That's not how you fight and win wars. And you cost American lives when you do. And we need a commander-in-chief who understands that and will point that out clearly. And it brings into question, are we willing to prevail? And of course, they didn't learn the lessons, because then they tried to go into Libya leading from behind. Cited it, as Hillary did and as Obama did, as a model for the 21st century. Libya was war from the air, minimal footprint, immediate transition. And here it is today, basically the annex for ISIS. And then you get what happened on 9/11 in Benghazi as well. An administration unwilling to tell the truth about what happened there. So I think in winning wars, America has the ability to show the resolve and finish them. I think a citizenry prepared to get behind them. If we have a president willing to stand up and articulate what the mission is, what it's all about, give our commanders the resources they need, and go to fight and win. We still have that spirit in America. And you understand the caveat. It doesn't mean we fight everywhere, all the time, every enemy. Not every boogeyman is someone America needs to fight. Just when we choose a fight, we should finish that fight. It says a lot about who we are as a people. Now, social engineering. Everyone's favorite topic, right? Social engineering is when it ceases to become about winning and starts to become about some manifestation of social justice. Some manifestation of what it ought to look like, as opposed to making sure we fortify that institution to be the finest fighting force it can be. When you take your eye off that ball, it starts to lead you down a lot of weird corridors, which is exactly where we've seen it go inside the Pentagon today. And again, I talked about Gates and Panetta and Hagel and even Ash Carter. They've all talked about how political it is. They've all talked about how the control is really centralized in the National Security Council, which is inside the White House, which are political appointees. So you've got, 29-year-olds who knew how to run a campaign thinking they know how to run a theater war. It's a bad idea. And they're the ones giving the advice to the commander-in-chief as opposed to the Pentagon planners and others saying, hey, this is what's possible, this is what we need. And they become obsessed with different aspects. So you get as a result a culling effect, a filtration effect. I don't call it a purge because I don't think they weren't immediately targeting people, but they basically said if you won't fall in line, your career is going to be over. So whether it's Mattis or Petraeus or McChrystal or a guy like Colonel Michael Steele, who was my brigade commander in Iraq, the war fighters, the break glass in case of war guys, are long gone. Or they've been pushed out, slowly but surely, in favor of who? The political house cats. And that's not to say everybody that's in the White House or at the top is bad. There's a lot of wonderful generals, great generals, who believe in America and are doing everything that they can. But if you don't think it has changed who gets where they get, you're wrong. And that's unfortunate, because we're going to need those break glass in case of war guys and gals again someday. And where will they be is the question, especially when it becomes even a guy like General Campbell in Afghanistan, who recently retired. It was said that he would have been chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a real warfighter of this generation, all the way through Iraq and Afghanistan, just at the front tip of the spear, decided to retire because he wasn't okay with what was happening in the reduction of the military. So you've got some folks quietly fading away saying, I can't take it anymore. Then it was stuff like don't ask, don't tell, which was their immediate target, right out the gate. We need to change that. And say what you want about that. People are passionate on that issue, but it was most centrally demonstrated with women in combat. This idea that there'll be gender neutrality in selection, all areas will be open, and we'll do studies though. We'll do studies, and we'll make sure that we're doing it responsibly and feasibly. Except which service did a really robust study? Which one did the most robust study about the effects of women in combat? The Marine Corps. God bless those guys. I'm an Army guy, but I'll give them their due every once in a while. They did a real study, and they said, if you're going to make us open up these spots, we're going to do it. And how long did that study hold up? Basically, the ink dried, and the White House said, you don't need your study. We're going to open up every single role, which is exactly what's going to happen. Because it was never about a study. It was never about warfighting capabilities. It was never about recognizing how it will work. It was about opening up every single position, no matter what, to women. Now, a lot of you probably have a certain position, and I think it's a sensible one. Well, if we maintain the same standard, then why not allow anyone to apply for positions? Now, my personal perspective is that there's certain reasons why I don't need Jack and Jill in a foxhole together. And that's, having been on the battlefield, something I believe in and agree with, even though I've seen some amazing women on the battlefield do some incredible things when placed in combat situations. There's no doubt about that. But what you're going to get with gender neutrality is, even if it starts out with the same standard, trust me, Pentagon bureaucracies, White House priorities turn into quotas. And they turn into pressure to say, wait, why does your infantry battalion only have one female? Why doesn't it have 10? Why are you at 2%? You need to be at 5%. You need to be at 10%. But they're not meeting the standards. Well, then, you've got to look at that standard. I don't think that's a fair standard. And we start to see the standards coming down for the men and up maybe a little bit for the women so we can get to a gender-neutral standard. I'm not saying that's happening right now. But anybody want to place a $20 bet, I'll meet you at the back at the end. Because if your priorities are not on warfighting capability and they're on something else, that's eventually the way it's going to go. And it creates a more difficult fight for the next generation. I could be for it if I felt like the standards were going to stay. And I think in some places they will. Some of our elite units and Navy SEALs and special operators and others, they're going to have nothing of it. And good on them. And I know there's so many men and women of integrity in our military, they're going to fight this tooth and nail. So it's not an indictment of the entire system, but it's a recognition of priorities. And then, of course, it's all in the pursuit of diversity, which, hey, I'm all fine with diversity as a means. It's when diversity becomes an ends unto itself that it becomes a problem. Hey, diversity is just fine. I love a diverse group of people, but doesn't necessarily need to be the end of what our military does. Give me the best fighters, no matter what their skin color, race, or creed, and let's go defeat the enemy. And I think that's the perspective that we need to have. So, social justice infiltrating. Another example is military sexual assault, which is a problem. We shouldn't be having military sexual assault. Everybody understands that. We need to be taking care of it. You think you bring women into infantry or different units, you might exacerbate that a little bit. I'm not saying that's anybody's fault, but that's an unintended consequence of that priority also. But how do they address it? And the problem is a lot of addressing it has to do with misunderstanding command climates in the military. There are some commanders that don't handle things like that well. Totally get it. We've seen them. But when you start to say we're going to handle that problem by stripping out the authority of commanders, which was the solution, to say that we're going to take it out of the chain of command, it means you don't understand the military. It means you don't understand the importance of having a commander who can make that call, who can make that decision, who can control that climate, who can maintain a standard. That is how you ensure that a group of men and or women are willing to put their lives on the line together for a country in a moment against incredible odds, is when you have a commander who can make those tough calls. And when you start to erode that, you start to erode a lot of what the military is all about. So again, a good cause undercut by the way they go about trying to do it. Briefly, America's role in the world, I talked about it a little bit. I think Guantanamo Bay is a great example of how we view ourselves. So I served there in 2004 and 2005 as a guard. I was not a MP, meaning I wasn't walking the blocks. Those guys had the toughest job. Those are the ones getting feces and urine and stuff thrown on them every day. I mean, it was nasty. You think these guys in Guantanamo Bay are nice? You know, think again. There were 650 of them there in 2004 and 2005. We were on towers and gates. We did traffic control points. We were the QRF, so if things got a little dicey, we would go in, transfers from different places. And then I just went back to Guantanamo Bay about 6 weeks ago with Fox News Channel to report on the situation as it is right now. So I went back, and there are 90 detainees there. We know of those that have been released, 30% of them have returned to the battlefield as a minimum. A lot of them we don't know where they are or what they're doing. You think those last 90 are probably going to go home and just start the next small business? Probably not. But this administration, as we know, is hell-bent on releasing them, no matter what. It's a political statement. But it's because they see us as the problem. See, with this administration, it's always the blame America first perspective. We're the reason why they attacked us. Well, there wasn't a Gitmo before 9/11. Shh, quiet, quiet. Don't say that. It's always our sins creating what they're doing to us. So in their mind, just maniacally, we must close Gitmo, we must close Gitmo, we must close Gitmo. And they say it's propaganda. Although, you look in the Dabiq ISIS magazines, they're not talking about Gitmo. They're not talking about... You want to talk about when it would become a propaganda win for them? The day we close it. They'd probably dedicate the whole issue to it and say, and thumb their noses at us. And I can tell you, having seen it in 04 and 05, having seen it today, the caricature that the world paints of Guantanamo Bay is the exact opposite of the professional facility that we run there. There couldn't be a better location to hold these guys. The professionalism that they conduct themselves with is incredible. The extent to which we bend over backwards for these detainees with religious observances, with white gloves, with the same health care that our guards get, with the same dental work. You want to talk about the medical conditions they suffer from right now? Obesity, because we feed them so well. Libraries, DVDs, video games, satellite channels with 300 channels and wireless headphones. Indoor-outdoor activity time, you name it. Well, why? Because they want to keep it as quiet as possible so they can get them all out of there and they can shut it down. And they probably want to give away Guantanamo Bay too, the entire naval station, which we know in Barack Obama's eyes is just a sin of former American intervention and colonialism, right? So this is the perspective of our commander, and Guantanamo Bay tells us everything we need to know about how he views America's role in the world. Every other president before, good, bad, or otherwise, saw us as a force for good. We were imperfect in the application of that good, but saw us as a force for good. Barack Obama sees it quite differently, and you understand now, you see it through that lens, and the actions he takes, they look like incoherence. But they're not. There's a lot of incoherence in there too. But you add up leading from behind, strategic patience, and don't do stupid family program stuff. He didn't say stuff. Those are their doctrines. Their doctrines are don't be George W. Bush, which meant as imperfect as he was, he believed in America and America's role in the world, and that we were an important guarantor of freedom and free peoples. And Barack Obama says that no, we're just exceptional, just like France is exceptional, and just like Britain is exceptional. Which means we're not exceptional. And when you believe that, it's when America starts to fade to the background. I ask you this, and I think I mentioned it already. If not America, then who? If the 21st century is not an American century, it will not be a free century. Because after World War II, the Brits, exhausted after 2 wars, they took a knee. And what did they do? They handed the keys to the free world over to the young Americans. And they said, Go toe-to-toe with those communists. Hold the line. And we have, and we did. If we take a knee today, the keys go to who? Nobody. The Chinese dream, the Chinese civilization, when there literally is a Chinese dream, and it looks the exact opposite of ours, and they're trying to execute it right now. Islamism, ISIS, Iran, Putin, globalists, frankly. I mean, it's its own emerging civilization, the belief that we're perfectible and we could just sort of form some sort of a one-world government and we're all good. Those are the competing views. There isn't another vanguard of Western civilization. It was Western Europe. Western Europe isn't Western Europe the way it was Western Europe. And no one else has the capabilities that we do. So if we don't address our debt, if we don't address our military, if we don't rebuild it, if we don't get ourselves on the right track, history isn't over. And I don't want to be the world's policeman forever. But you better believe I'm willing to be the world's sheriff and I'm willing to be the world's leader until there is somebody that's capable to do it. Because there isn't anybody else. And I think our job, especially vets and others, but folks that understand it, is to fortify the American people that we can't be war-weary. What is war-weary? Honestly. Does it mean we quit? Does it mean we're done? We can't. And Ronald Reagan said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. You don't pass it to the next generation in the bloodstream. You got to fight for it. And I used to say all the time, I fought so my kids don't have to. And it's a comfy sentiment. And I want to say it because I want to believe it. We all want to slay the dragons of our generation so that we can give a peaceful period to the next generation. In some cases we have. In certain moments of time there have been that opportunity. But I don't say that anymore. I say I fight knowing that my kids are going to have to as well. And I hope they don't have to fight ISIS on foreign battlefields. I just know they're going to have to fight for something. Because freedom doesn't perpetuate itself. Human nature is not perfectible. We are all fallen men and women. The original sin exists and infects all of us and human nature. And governments are constituted either to defend freedom as they exist here in the United States or to advance their own agenda. And unfortunately, we've seen a fundamental transformation in this country that has created a very different perspective of the relationship between people and their government. And it's only going to be citizens who decide to fight back and who decide to declare that it will be a 21st century led by America. So that's how I look at our role in the world today, and I think it's some tough truths. And I don't think there's a lot of people in our electorate today, Republicans or Democrats, that want to hear that message. Because they want to say, there's a lot of comfy platitudes like it's time to nation build here at home. Listen, I get it. I get it. We've got stagnant wages and student debt and massive problems, entitlement class, all of that. And we need to address that. But we can't just say it's time to nation build at home so we're going to give up our responsibility. The world is more connected than ever. What happens on the other side of the world has more impact on us today than it has ever had. And so an American retreat from the world is going to have even greater consequences, as we have seen over the last 7 years when we retreat, because there is no other leader. Speaking of retreat, and I will close with this and we'll open it up to Q&A, I'll finish on the last topic that I mentioned, is our country's treatment of our veterans and how we treat these guys when they come home, guys and gals. And a lot of you are vets and a lot of you experienced the VA, and 2 years ago, basically now, is when the scandal was first revealed, the Phoenix scandal, where whistleblowers came up and provided evidence that there were secret lists being manipulated to hide the real wait times of veterans, and the veterans were died while waiting on lists. I think one of the most powerful things about that revelation is that it blew open what veterans had known for years and years and years and years, and had experienced. Massive wait times, bureaucratic roadblocks, not the kind of professional treatment that they deserve. So here we are 2 years later, and how are we doing? Well, it turns out single-payer, government-run, top-down healthcare still doesn't work. Because that's what it is. You want to talk about Obamacare? Veterans have had it. They have it right now. It's called the Department of Veterans Affairs. It's called government-run healthcare without a choice. Now, I always have people come up to me afterwards and say, my VA is great. My doctors are great. My people are great. And for that, I say, fantastic. I'm glad. Because there are great employees, there are great facilities, there are people that do good work. And I always acknowledge that. And if you live next to one of those facilities, good, you're set. What about the guy that lives next to a crappy facility? That doesn't care? That's got a 4-month wait time for a basic appointment? Or in Boston, 700 days for an appeals claim? Or Baltimore, where it's 650 days? I mean, what if you live there? Then you're trapped in a system where you're treated like a second-class citizen. And the solutions are not that hard, but they become very difficult in Washington, D.C. And if I've never been skeptical that there's a status quo or an establishment, but I've seen it and it's been revealed to me through my own little fight on the Department of Veterans Affairs. Everyone says it's a nonpartisan issue, and I get it. It should be a nonpartisan issue. But you have Republicans and Democrats in Washington, D.C. so wedded to the VA bureaucracy, so wedded to the government unions, so wedded to veterans groups that are part of the status quo as well, that they refuse to change the system, regardless of what the veterans want. And so they all get together and they say the lowest common denominator we can agree on is always what? More money. Just the next $5 billion is going to put us over the horizon. We're going to have a perfect VA system. It just never arrives. But just that next $5 billion, we'll get it knocked out. Never do we get we get a lot of talk about accountability. We get talk about transparency. We get talk about efficiency. But because we never hold anybody accountable, do you know how many people have been fired for the waitlist scandal at Phoenix for the actual manipulation? 0 to 1. You could maybe kind of count 1, but they found other reasons why to get that person fired. Pretty much 0. You've got employees that literally embezzled $140,000 and they were given a new job at the same salary. Evidence exists. They can't fire them. Yet we can't get the Republican chairman of the Senate VA committee to advise McConnell to pass the VA Accountability Act, which would give the VA secretary the ability to fire underperforming managers. The House passed it with Democrat votes. Republicans are literally sitting on it. And I blasted Isaacson on his home radio station in Georgia just 2 days ago. And I like him. He's a good guy. I like him on a lot of issues. I have no axe to grind with him. But he's just part of sitting on it. And no one knows why. Well, it's because he's in meetings with the White House and the VA and the other groups, and they don't want that accountability. Because when's the last time a bureaucracy reformed itself? It's never, ever going to happen. And then you get an issue like choice. You know, when we started fighting for this, we asked veterans, what do you want? No one ever asked the vets what they want. The vets groups in Washington always tell the congressmen what their members want. But their members are they could do a self-selection survey and decide whatever they want. So we did a bulletproof survey nationwide, what do veterans want? 90% of them said, I want a choice. I just want a choice to either go to the VA or go to a private provider, and my dollars follow me either way. Does that make just a little bit of sense? So we fight for that, and you wouldn't imagine how difficult, and that's like blowing people's mind in Washington, D.C., that you would try to do that. So we're going to advance legislation that does just that, and we're going to meet massive and overwhelming resistance in the process. But the nice part is we've got the high ground in this, and we're going to fight, and we're going to shoot down, and we're going to go after it. Because veterans want it, they deserve it, and when you introduce choice, the VA has to finally compete for a veteran. And we all know, as folks that understand the free market, when folks compete, when you shine that light, there's an incentive to say, I will do good by those people because I want that customer, I want that veteran. And it changes the entire dynamic. So everyone in Washington wants to sign a big bill with a bunch of funding and new initiatives. How about just a little bit of accountability and a little bit of choice and a little bit of competition and transparency? And I think we could do a lot of good for vets. But it's a really hard fight because the status quo in Washington is really, really powerful. So I don't want you to leave here pessimistic about our country, which I've done for you very well. I'm being honest because I will end with this about veterans. Our veterans are not victims. Our veterans are the future leaders of this country. And there's a lot of guys and gals we need to take care of that have hidden wounds, seen or unseen, that we need to deal with and help them. But we also can't stigmatize them that they're ticking time bombs and permanent damaged goods. The vets in your community who are managing things and transitioning are going to be the future leaders of this country, along with other patriots. And I got a lot of hope for those guys and gals, because they've seen a lot of tough stuff on the battlefield, they've learned a lot of lessons, and they're coming back ready to roll up their sleeves and do good things. We're already seeing great leaders in Congress and in the Senate from this generation doing those types of things. So there's big fights to be had. But you know, when you did the countdown to the next administration, if we can manage to elect somebody that believes in America, then America can come back. It really can. Ronald Reagan did it, and we can do it again. God bless you all. Thank you very much.
Well, there's a lot of good questions here, so we'll, as I'm organizing one, the first one was actually hand-delivered during your comments, Pete, kind of administrative and I think very flattering. How do the people here get a signature on their book when it comes out? Hey. Is there any way to set that up?
Who submitted that question?
I'm not sure, but it's...
Yeah, that's true. No, seriously, if you want, go to PeteHegseth.com, which is my website, and if you order the book and then fill out a really simple form. It sends me an email, and then I know, and then put the personalized message in there, and I'll sign it. And so it's that easy. So just, you've got to order it first to make sure it's coming, and then just fill out, it's like your name and the address and a personalized thing, send it in. It's all on the same site, and we'll get a signed copy out. So it's meant to be as easy as possible, and it's just my first name and last name.com.
Okay, that's really great. And we're going to start, we're trying to get
come back.
Yeah,
so we'll do that.
Just to come back for another team. One of our questioners was with the problem that the Wounded Warriors has gone through. They've gone through some issues as to where funds go. Do you have a recommendation for helping the vets that's outside of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Wounded Warrior Project does a lot of good for veterans. I think they got themselves in trouble by overspending and creating a bad perception, and it was unfortunate. I oftentimes find that there's a lot of great local veterans organizations that fill the local gaps. I'm on the board of a group called Eagles Healing Nest in Minnesota, up north near St. Cloud, and they are literally a veterans empowerment home where they help vets that are transitioning through the VA or not served by the VA the way they should. It's, drug-free, job opportunities, training. They get them in there, they support them, and they get them out. And so I help them because they're right there on the ground, and they're right there where veterans' needs need to be met. And then if there's other veterans advocacy organizations that you're interested in, I'm happy to share my opinion on that as well. But I feel like local groups usually.
Okay, there are a bunch of questions we can kind of group together, and probably to no surprise. Of the current presidential candidates, do you see any of them that, and I think you may have touched on this, who has what it takes to win the war? And if so, who? Various wars, your choice.
I'm gonna play the Fox News I can't comment card. No, I'm just kidding. No, I think there are. I have no doubt that both Ted Cruz and Donald Trump would fight wars to win. And I think they would both apply necessary firepower. Now, I feel like Ted Cruz has more experience, in my personal opinion, on some of these matters, having hosted an event with him and watched him talk on it. He understands it and gets it, and I think in a depth of ways that I think Marco Rubio did as well. I really liked his ability to articulate and understand military and national security policy. And I think both of them would unleash war fighters and get the lawyers out of the way, which is really a big impediment to how we fight wars. I think we have to be careful with some of the rhetoric that we use about how we're going to do it, which can be unhelpful at times. But I do question what, obviously, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, they're going to probably fight the same kind of more or less politically correct wars that are sort of tinkering at the margins. You can't get worse than what Barack Obama is doing, barely. Bernie would probably be worse. Hillary would probably be a little bit better than Obama. But I think Cruz would probably be the best.
Okay, thank you for that. This will be interesting. We can be theoretical here. If you could select the next Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, who would be on your short list?
Oh, man. John Bolton and Alan West.
Wow.
Pretty good, right? That would bring America back a little bit. Ralph Peters would be up there for me, too. He's pretty good.
Okay. Would you say that Operation Iraqi Freedom was a mistake, or success, or qualified success?
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't call it a mistake. I think we didn't finish it properly. And I wish we would have candidates that would stand up for that. And I think that was in my opinion, that was the beginning of the undoing of Jeb Bush, was his 4 different stances on the war at the beginning. And when he should have just sort of stood behind it and stood up for it the way that I think he wanted to in his gut, and ended up changing his position a little bit. Like I said in my remarks, I think we should be more forceful in the way that we articulate the fact that that war was won, and there's a massive opportunity cost to giving it away. And I don't think the world is a better place if we had just sat aside and watched Saddam Hussein ignore 17 UN resolutions and be a belligerent in the region. It doesn't mean every aspect of how we went in was perfect, and I wouldn't defend every part of it, but I wouldn't call it a mistake.
Okay. 2 sort of related questions. Can Congress stop Obama from giving Gitmo back to Cuba? And why can't Congress stop the release of the prisoners?
Congress has done a lot to prevent Obama, and even Obama has had to acknowledge that he's limited in what he can do to bring them to the United States because he legally cannot do that per what's been passed in Congress. Although they made him submit a plan, which he had to outline where he would send them in the United States, except he didn't actually outline where he was going to send them. So I think he's going to find every extra constitutional executive order way he can to close it out by probably he's going to push as many as he can out in the next couple of months through those that have been approved for release. And then my guess would be that if he's going to try to close it, he's going to do it in one fell swoop with a massive transfer to somewhere in the Middle East that isn't Guantanamo Bay, so that he can say, he's going to try to get it down to 60, 50, 40, and then try to do it all at once. I don't know if he's going to be able to do it, and one of the hopes that I really have is that he won't be, that Congress will stay vigilant on it, and that this tool will be available to the next commander-in-chief. Because not only do I think we shouldn't close it, but I think we should be sending dudes from ISIS there and interrogating them and getting information we need.
This question relates to your rules of engagement comments. National Review recently ran a feature on soldiers in the battlefield having to call an off-site JAG officer to get permission to fire. In your experience, how common is that, and how burdensome has it become?
It is very common, and it is very burdensome. And I will tell you a story just from 2005. I had just arrived as a platoon leader with the Rakkasans, 3rd Brigade of the 101st, a great unit. And we had gone through our training. I had joined the unit late in the game at Fort Campbell, trained with them there, and then we trained in Kuwait, and we got in country. And we almost immediately got a briefing from a JAG officer. And I remember sitting in that room with my platoon, and he was talking about rules of engagement. We got a number of different scenarios. They always talk about it through the lens of scenarios, because that's helpful to understand how to apply it. And he said, you see a guy on the street with an RPG, and he's not pointing at you. He's got it, and he's kneeling, and he's not pointing at you. Can you shoot at him? And my guys were like, hell yeah! And he was like, no, you can't. And then he said, but then you can shoot at him when he turns the RPG at you. That was 2005. So if you think about the layers of lawyers between 2005 and 2016, add a lot more constraints and commanders even more afraid of what comes from the top. But I will tell you this, a lot of that changed within our unit, because we had a brigade commander in Michael Steele, Full Bird, who believed in unleashing war fighters, and there were some problems. It wasn't perfectly applied, obviously, for those of you that are familiar with the unit and our deployment time there, but you knew he had your back. And as a result, I think it created some complications in some places where there was ambiguity, but more or less it created an environment where soldiers felt like the commander at least had their back, and there was some clarity on rules of engagement. But yes, you're getting, right now against the Islamic State, I mean, we're dropping leaflets on truck drivers of oil convoys telling them we're going to bomb you in an hour, rather than just bomb. You know why? Because they consider the driver of that truck a civilian casualty. That's how far we've sort of lost our mind in understanding what it takes to defeat an enemy. It's absurd.
This question relates to our Commander-in-Chief's latest Cuba-Argentine vacation. And the question was, Fidel Castro had some very angry thoughts, it must be, with Obama's visit. What is his status in Cuba? Can you talk about the Castro brothers?
I think they're actually in a great place, the Castro brothers, unfortunately. They didn't have to give up any political reforms, and they got massive economic investment. And I think we've had this fallacy, and it started with China, that if you open up economically, it will automatically lead to political reform. And we haven't seen that in China. Look at what the regime has done there. They have opened up and enriched themselves. They've enriched government-run corporations that enrich the regime or their cronies, and they use that money to crack down on their population. That is exactly the playbook. It's called the China model that Cuba will replicate with the support of regimes like China and North Korea and others, because it's the same axis of folks that help each other. So the Castro brothers are laughing all the way to the bank on this, and they're going to enrich themselves, and the likelihood of political change there is minimal, absent some sort of a unforeseen event that changes the leadership dynamic completely. So it's, once again, a completely foolish, short-sighted perspective from this administration. Their lodestar is engagement. Engagement is their end state. And again, ends and means is where they confuse it engagement is a fine means. Reagan used it with the Soviet Union, but we also knew Reagan was an anti-communist. In this scenario, we've got an administration that is opening up their fist and they're putting their hand out to engage with avowed enemies in Iran and Cuba and elsewhere, and they're laughing all the way to their nuclear bomb and to their enriched regime in Cuba.
Can you comment on soldiers who are being held at Leavenworth prison for being soldiers?
Yeah, I don't know all the particulars of all those cases, and I do know Beverly Pearlson and a few others who are just tireless advocates for guys on the battlefield who have been a part of unfortunate incidents. There are some guys at Leavenworth who made really bad choices on the battlefield, and I do think there have to be consequences for abject war crimes. If you're doing something that is just completely unlawful and ruthless, then there is a consequence for that. That's why the military said it won't follow unlawful orders from their commander-in-chief. There's a standard, there's an ethos, there's a belief that we are above what so many things that our enemies or others would do. But there are also plenty of guys there. Clint Lawrence is a name that comes to mind immediately, a lieutenant who made a tough call, I believe it was in Afghanistan. Was a little bit overzealous, but it was a really uncertain situation, and he ended up engaging a couple of guys on a motorbike, and because he didn't know if they were enemy or not, and the enemy uses motorbikes as suicide bombs, and it was actually found later on that these guys that were killed were actually tied to the insurgency, but the Army investigators hid it. There's just some shady stuff. So there are definitely guys in prison today in Leavenworth who have gotten the wrong side of justice, but there are also some guys there that there are going to be consequences for illegal actions as well. So it's a mixed bag.
Okay. With all we've heard with tonight and other times about the military, are there problems getting new recruits?
Well, one of the big problems getting new recruits is that I think only 30% of Americans who are eligible are actually qualified for military service. For reasons of obesity and intelligence and education, they're really only drawing from 30% of the population to begin with. And then you've got, right now they're meeting their recruiting goals, thankfully. But it is, over time, if you've demoralized the military, if you've got a VA system that looks like it doesn't work, although that's not a big part of the mindset of the psychology of an 19-year-old who's enlisting. But morale matters, and what people say to the next generation. I hear a lot of veterans. I'm not here yet on it at all, but I've heard veterans say, "Hey, I don't want my kids to join this military today." I can understand under Barack Obama in some ways with the rules of engagement and the culture, but I still want to believe and hope that there are plenty of Americans who understand what this country represents that are willing to put their lives on the line, and families that understand the importance of that to encourage their son or daughter. I just hope we get a commander-in-chief befitting of that loyalty.
Yeah, good answer. That's really good. Well, here's a potential softball for you. Is Russia's Putin a peacemaker?
I looked into his eyes and saw his soul. I think a couple of administrations probably haven't gotten him right. He took the reset button and ran with it. And, you got Ukraine yelling for aid. And what are they yelling for? They're yelling for lethal aid, and the only thing we'll give them is non-lethal aid, is meals ready to eat. As Russian tanks and special operators infiltrate and create rebel forces and literally redrawn lines in Eastern Europe. And you've got John Kerry telling us that all those actions are so 19th century. Really, he's preaching to them saying, "Oh, this is all so centuries ago," while armies literally mobilized to take territory. So yeah, he's a thug. It's a gas station with a country affiliated to it. He's got massive energy interests that he is making sure he can further, and tightening his grip on power. And if you don't think Putin and others look back on the heydays of the Soviet Union and covet that, you're wrong. Of course they would love to bring back that predominance, and they're trying on the margins. And Obama says this, and he's right. We have the better cards. They don't have, but he's playing a better hand, even though we've got better cards, because he's playing a bold leadership hand.
This is a little channel change, but not much. What are your thoughts about Hegel taking waterboarding off the table?
I think it's a mistake. Absolutely a mistake. And thankfully, the next commander, who was it? Brennan recently, the CIA director, said that he wouldn't follow orders if he was told to. Well, guess what? I don't think you're going to be the CIA director under a President Cruz or President Trump, right? Probably going to get a new CIA director. And thankfully, well, this is the same guy who a couple of years ago said that it was those same enhanced interrogation techniques that helped lead to bin Laden. And now he's parroting the Obama line by saying, oh, it doesn't work, it's so inhumane. It's, again, political, completely. And these guys, they lose their mind and their principles when they get to Washington and they get access to power. You talk to folks that have been a part of that, they'll recognize that it works. You've got to use it selectively when necessary. And all it's going to take is an executive order from a new president to change that policy. And it would require explaining it to the American people. And I think if you explain why you use it and when you use it because of the nature of the enemy, the American people have the fortitude to understand that.
Here's sort of a blast from the past. Would you like to speak on the exchange of Bo Bergdahl for 5 terrorists?
I mean, there's literally nothing to say there. I mean, it is. Well, no. In retrospect, it was in many ways the beginning of the complete exiting of Guantanamo Bay. It was an excuse to get rid of the 5 worst at the beginning, deal with the firestorm, so he could begin the push out. That was a huge part of it. I also think at some level, and I know we all feel like it's well orchestrated at the White House. I think they were utterly caught off guard for some amazing reason by the backlash of what this guy had done and the scrutiny of his activity. That White House Rose Garden ceremony.
That was uncomfortable.
They had to have immediately known that was. I can't even. And this. So, but think about this. The most powerful aspect of it is every single military family that lost a service member, that lost the life of someone in these conflicts, that didn't get a Rose Guard ceremony, that didn't even get a letter or a phone call, and then Bo Bergdahl and his parent, a traitor, gets a Rose Guard ceremony. While we trade 5 guys with blood on their hands, it's the worst symbol of this administration.
Yeah, agreed. Okay. A more serious question. You said there's no country where the military can compete with the U.S. Are you aware of certain countries having hydrogen bombs?
Well, I'm aware of certain countries recently applying technology for a hydrogen bomb, like North Korea. And let me tell you about North Korea. What did Bill Clinton tell us about the North Korea deal? They're never going to get nukes. We cut a deal. It's solid. That's what he told us. And they even used it as an example. It is an exact preview of Iran. It is exactly what Iran will do. They will cheat, as they already are. They will seek ballistic missiles technology, as they already are. They will use the money coming in, that they already are. And now they've got European investment inside that country, which they're not going to get rid of. They're going to slow walk their way to a bomb, and there's no doubt. And this administration had to have known that from the very beginning. They've totally reshuffled the entire power dynamic of the Middle East, which will only destabilize it further. So yeah, I mean, we don't even understand. Folks also don't understand things like electromagnetic pulse technology and different things regimes are going to try to use in order to really, they could cripple us and bring us to our knees if we don't understand the nature of what other people are trying to do. So yeah, that technology, and then yet we've got a president whose goal is global zero. Have you heard? Which, listen, don't we all wish we could just sing Kumbaya and get rid of the nuclear bombs? Doesn't that sound great? It's just zero detachment with reality, or attachment to reality, telling us we're going to get to zero. We disarm while all the other enemies continue to pursue technology, and we're also not upgrading our weapons capability. Our nuclear triad and our nuclear capabilities are eroding. We haven't upgraded a lot of the systems. We're finding ourselves more and more flat-footed, and these regimes are seeking an equalizer. They look at our military, they look at what we've got. We've got 10 carriers, no one else has more than one. We've got all the fighter jets, we've got the 101st and the 82nd and all the special operators. But if they have one EMP or one hydrogen bomb, that's the equalizer. You wonder why we didn't go into Pakistan or do what we had to do on that Pakistan-Afghanistan border during that war, even though the Taliban had a haven in Halkani? Because they got a bomb. And that's all they needed to tell us to pound sand. And that's what every other regime is going to try to do. And by opening up the Pandora's box with Iran, now Saudi Arabia wants a bomb, Now Egypt wants a bomb, and they all want a bomb, and that sounds like a great idea. All those guys. So yeah, it's bad.
We've had two questions independently that came across about carpet bombing, the definition, how people use it, how the military use it. A few comments on carpet bombing.
Yeah, I think I understand, and it's been mostly attributed, and Ted Cruz has used it most frequently. I think he knows what he's saying and why he's saying it. I don't think he's talking about the traditional use of the word carpet bomb, which is just absolutely and indiscriminately level everything. What he's talking about is going well beyond pinprick strikes. What he's talking about is and he talks about the Gulf War, and when we used overwhelming numbers of sorties and air power to absolutely level and devastate our enemy. What kills me is that what he's talking about, or I think Donald Trump would be talking about, is that we know where ISIS's headquarters are in Raqqa. Like, we literally know where their command post is in Raqqa. But because there's houses nearby, like, we won't level it. And I think in his administration, ISIS headquarters are gone. And I think we believe that's a good thing. And it's not because he wants civilian casualties. It's because our enemy has to realize they can't just use the local population as shields in perpetuity. People die in war. No one wants civilian casualties less than America. But if we're not willing to fight a war, we can't win a war.
That's true. Well, here's an easy one. How should America handle ISIS? And should Russia be involved?
Well, Russia already is involved. I mean, we can't extract Russia now that we've created a vacuum that they completely exploited. I would be lying to you if I told you I had a good solution for the situation in Iraq and Syria. It's an absolute mess. Because Assad has fortified himself with the help of Iranian and Russian troops on the ground, helping him gain back territories from rebels. So if there were these so-called moderate rebels, which was a sketchy proposition to begin with, and I think there were some forces that we could have worked with many years ago, those are long gone. And you've got an Assad regime consolidating power with the help of Russia and Iran that's not going anywhere. And they were never targeting ISIS, a little bit, just as a show. And ISIS is kind of sort of useful to them, and countries in the regime and in the region that we want to join our so-called Arab alliance are actually quietly funding ISIS. And so there's a duplicitous game going on there too. I think the best recourse we could take to begin with is to utterly crush them out of the country of Iraq and secure that area to begin with by assisting the Kurds, by truly doubling down with the Iraqi army that is there, and pushing them out with overwhelming firepower and just absolutely devastating them, and then raining hellfire down on Raqqa and their capital, and making it such an untenable situation there. And then you've got to go after. The last 2 mornings on Fox and Friends, I was able to interview Dr. Sebastian Gorka, who's the top professor at the Marine Corps University. And we talked about ISIS and ISIS's funding stream. I mean, they make $4 million a day. $4 million a day on oil revenue and extortion, as well as other black market activities and taxing the local population. And we're barely scratching the surface of a lot of that. We have to put the screws to countries in the region that we know are secretly funding ISIS and that we know are secretly accepting and buying oil on the black market from ISIS. We have the power and the leverage to do that. I think a guy like Donald Trump speaks very powerfully to that we don't use the leverage that we need and we have against these countries that we know are stabbing us in the back. So I think there's attributes of what these candidates are talking about that cobble together a strategy where you could take the fight to ISIS, but make no mistake about it. Until that black flag is down, this problem ain't going anywhere. Yeah, it's not going anywhere. They've got their caliphate, and their caliphate motivates their forces elsewhere. And even if you take it down in Iraq and Syria, they've got a serious foothold in Libya, and they've infiltrated across Europe. This is a generational problem, an ideological problem, an infiltration problem, but also centrally a battlefield problem. And it's going to take tens of thousands of dead ISIS fighters to change this equation.
Well, back to a little comic relief. Talking about the candidates, if Hillary was to win, how likely would there be a military coup? You don't really have to answer that, but I love the question, unless you'd like to.
Very unlikely, but there would be a lot of dissatisfaction in the ranks, yes. I mean, it's well documented how little respect the Clinton White House had for the military, and I think that perception and feeling still permeates the ranks. Listen, though, I mean, why I'm so proud of our military, I'm a conservative Republican, but I've served honorably under a liberal Democrat, and I respect my Constitution more than I do the allegiance to any individual. And I know in our military that's what matters. So we have a fidelity in that institution.
That's nice. This one's really specific, but maybe you can speak to it. What is the current status of chaplains in the military, especially those from Christian denominations?
I know there's been increasing sort of political pressure in a sense, because there's outside pressure from groups like the ACLU and others, and I don't have all the details on this, but that are sort of accusing Christian chaplains and others of proselytizing and creating an overwhelmingly religious and Christian culture, which those of us who've been in the military just sort of look at that and say, you're absolutely absurd. No, really. I mean, it is part of the erosion of traditional institutions inside our military that have always made our military special. Our military isn't society. You join the military, you kind of give up some of your First Amendment rights. And you do. You can't speak out. You give up a lot of your rights. You also earn a great many of privileges and opportunities to be a part of that fighting force. And you also, I mean, our military has recognized that the moral health, the religious health of that fighting force is critical. Especially, I remember, I remember talking to chaplains both in Iraq and Afghanistan and Guantanamo Bay. They're your sort of spiritual guiding light when you're there, and even here stateside. But just like any other public institution in our world today, in the public square, secularists are trying to strip faith out. Every single aspect. And they're doing it in the military too, where they can, and because we have a commander-in-chief who is not willing to articulate his defense of those traditional institutions, they chip away and they chip away and they chip away. And we've seen it through any number of different lawsuits. I don't have all the details on that, but it is true that it is happening.
Okay, we just have a couple more. We're running short on time, and I apologize if it didn't get to your question. There's a lot of ones here. We've tried to keep it as general as possible. When you talk about women in the military, someone always brings up thought, well, how does it work in Israel? Do you have thoughts about Israel, women in the military, and how that could apply to the U.S.?
I had a chance to go to Israel a couple of years ago, and seeing Israel, walking the terrain of Israel, is understanding Israel. I also wrote a couple of op-eds for National Review when I came back about how I was almost envious of the sort of the permeation of resolve in that society. It's a permanent existential threat to their existence, and as a result, there's this ethos of patriotism and commitment that crosses the entire country and gender, and we are all in this fight together. We are so fortunate to live in the convenience of these oceans and these largely benign countries that we don't even think about what Israel deals with in its vulnerabilities surrounding them. And so they have obviously, whether it's guerrilla warfare, whether it's counterterrorism operations, whether it's integration of men and women in the military, Israel is clearly an example of a country that's been able to do that. So I don't want to make an ideological statement that it's impossible to do. It's also a much smaller country with a much, you would say, particular set of threats that they can really orient on, setting aside the nuclear threat that we've now introduced for them through Iran. But on the ground, it's more particular, whereas there's just a much more disparate set of responsibilities and threats that the United States has to confront, different types of units and capabilities, many more of them, and just a different ethos and perspective in this country than Israel has. So I don't think you could just say apples to apples. There's probably some great things we could learn from them about integration, as it inevitably happens here, but two different countries in a sense.
And maybe to leave on a more up note, what can all of us do to get young people more involved and knowledgeable about what it means to be a citizen, a citizenry?
Well, I heard about this book.
You're welcome.
You know what, I will say this. I think we all think of citizenship, and we think of voting or we think of protesting, or we think of city council meetings, or we think of jury duty, or the box checking exercises of citizenship, which are all important and all good. Being involved is important. What Roosevelt writes about in his book, and what I was so attached to, is that citizenship first is a set of responsibilities an individual undertakes. It is the ethos of hard work, of earning a living. That if you're a protester or a do-gooder for others, but you can't keep for your own family, you are not a good and efficient citizen. If you're unwilling to fight, meaning fit and willing to fight physically or fighting for causes in your country that protect the freedoms that you have. He talks about having lots of kids, literally. And I'll tell you a story. In Afghanistan, I had an interpreter, and his name was Esmatullah. Great kid, 17 years old, not radical, but a fairly devout Muslim, worked with us. I signed his deal. He's loyal. He lives in the United States somewhere here, just a good guy. And he said to me, we were having a long conversation one night, and we were talking about faith and my Christianity and his Islam and all about it. And he said, well, Pete, it's just inevitable. Islam will rule the world. The prophet foretold it. We're having 10 kids and you're having 1. Do the math. And he didn't say it in a nasty way. He didn't say it in an infiltration way. He said it in a, hey, just kind of going to happen because you're sitting it out and we're going. So I'm not saying I'm not saying everybody's got to have 10 kids. And I'm trying to convince my wife to have number 4, but she's stuck at 3 right now. God bless her. She gets the biggest vote. So, but I do think big, large, healthy, patriotic families are a good thing. And I think an important responsibility, but raising those kids in a healthy way, understanding our country and patriotic about our country is important. And then the bottom line is character, is raising kids. I mean, George Washington talked about the indispensable supports of a republic, our faith. We strip faith out of our schools, out of our public square, out of who we are, and then we wonder why it goes downhill. It's reinstilling that value in, I wish, I'm a public school kid, I wish I want to send my kids to public school. I just worry about having to undo what they're told over 8 hours every single day. And so we pay to send our kids to Liberty Classical Academy, a Christian classical academy that reinforces the values that we represent. And so I think we have to be intentional about infusing and shaping these citizens, but not in a cocoon where they don't engage with the rest of the world. It's fortifying them to be good citizens and good patriots in that world is I think where you start. So.
Well, I don't think I've ever been so uplifted and depressed at the same time. But thank you so much,
Thank
Captain
you all very
Hegseth,
much.
a wonderful speaker tonight. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Hang on.